Hello, welcome back to the channel. This is another video talking about the Vampire Rivals card game from Renegade Games. In these videos, I'm going to be talking about the card game and melding it with my knowledge of the background and lore of the games. So today, in case you haven't worked out by the title of this video, this is all about the titles in the game. And by exploring the titles and the traditions of the Camarilla, which is a sister video to this, to understand how the Camarilla works best, I recommend watching both those videos. We understand how the Camarilla works. Now, the Camarilla isn't the only sect of vampires. There's the Anarchs and the Sabbat in the world, but they are the biggest, and they are basically the template for how White Wolf, the writers of the role-playing game, wrote their cities to work. Now, the Camarilla itself isn't a big global government of vampires. It basically is a collection of city domains. And the vampires, the eldest, network amongst themselves, but essentially the eldest of them is called the Prince, and they rule their domain. This is called a praxis. There is a level of organization above the domains called the Inner Circle, and a couple of titles connected with that. But primarily, vampires live in cities. The reason for this is twofold. First is cities where more people are. Vampires need blood to survive, therefore living where most people are makes best sense for getting the food resources that you need. With more people comes the fact it's easier to hide amongst them. And the game is called Vampire the Masquerade. Vampires must not show and allow mortals to know that they are vampires. Imagine if you're in a small town and strange things start happening to people, more people might start looking and finding out that there's a vampire, but odd things, it's easier to hide in a city. It's also fairly difficult to travel between cities, domains. There are other supernatural threats and just the hazards of trying to go cross country when you can't go out during the day causes its own problems. Therefore, cities tend to be where vampires reside. So that makes the Prince of the City one of the most important characters and titles in the game. Now, as we can see, Prince of the City, the Prince is a very public figure. Hence, secrecy is always 0. So that's probably also a bit of game balance, because being Prince means that you're going to gain prestige and agenda points every turn. But the Prince themselves is always public, always known, and is expected to be seen and to rule. Certainly a lot of vampires cover a lot of influence from the shadows and control things. However, the Prince, as I said before, is expected, is a front person. Now, the Prince, because through the tradition of the domain, gets to say what goes on, how things are structured. So the Prince would be giving out these titles. So as we see there, the character has +2 influence. The Prince has +2 influence, which would, with your leader, give you 3 influence, which starts opening up or making the rest of the titles easy to get hold of. Now the Prince, what it says in the book, I've got the lexicon from V5 with us here. A vampire who has claimed a given expanse of domain as their own, generally a city, and supports that claims against all others. The term can refer to a kindred of either sex. The other thing is, a domain might also be called a praxis. So a praxis seizure would be you attempting to take a princedom off another vampire. So praxis, the right of the prince to govern. Prince's claim to domain. This term also refers to princes' matters of policy and individual edicts and motions. So that is a prince. The most important position in the city. If you've got the prince in your pocket, you can basically do whatever you wish in that domain. Now, next up on the right hand side of the prince, or left as we look at it, Shena Shell. And the Shena Shell is a prince's factotum. They're the person that organises all the prince's business, deals with the night-to-night details, organises who gets to see the prince, who doesn't get to see the prince. Often the person given reports to the prince. So to be on the Shena Shell's good side means that your reputation will be enhanced with the prince. However, if you are not on the prince's good side, on the Shena Shell's good side, you're going to take a constant hit on your prestige available to you. If no one controls the prince of the city, they lose 2 instead. So that's a Shena Shell take instead. If the prince was indisposed, a Shena Shell is a person who would be taking full control of the city and making things happen. Now, next to the prince, we'll have the sheriff. The sheriff is the prince's enforcer. They are the main muscle in the city and are both investigators and executioners of the prince's will. They are feared in domain and given wide powers to deal with problems before they become issues. Sheriffs do tend towards being the more physical, and so like a Bruja sheriff or a Gangrel sheriff would be quite common in days gone by. Now, what we see here is the sheriffs are able to throw their power around and remove ongoing cards. So if we, in itself, so quite a powerful ability, the ongoing cards can be quite nasty when they start stacking up. Now, this doesn't represent the sheriff getting stuck in and going and dealing with it fire and fury, but the sheriff might go up to the toreador and say, look, you've got this problem. This PR firm is getting quite close to knowing that vampires exist and they're about. It might be in your best interest if you can just close them down, move them on to another city. And it's best you do that before I have a more physical conversation with you about it. Because that's how vampires work. They don't control things directly. So you'll never really get a vampire CEO of a company. What you would get is a vampire who controls the CEO of a company, as an example. That's why you don't normally get vampiric celebrities, because then the masquerade is much harder to maintain. Under the prince, I'll put them here, the primogen. And the primogen is an interesting position. In the tabletop game, primogen are the most powerful vampires in the city, sometimes forming a prince's advisory council, sometimes forming a counterbalance to the prince. Now, in live role-playing games, they tended to have more players. Each clan tended to have a primogen. So sometimes players might expect each clan in a city to have a primogen. Certainly in tabletop, that's not the case, and it's something that's just evolved for live role-playing. And primogen are the real power players in a domain. Things often happen at the behest of the primogen. And banded together, the primogen probably have the power to remove an abusive prince, tyrannical prince. Primogen will often meet in council. You might hear a phrase called a primogen council. And I suppose this card represents this quite well. So exert 3 influence. Attached to the acting vampire. Character has +1 influence. Primogen are the movers and shakers in the city. Certainly a lot of my plots when I run tabletop games revolve around the primogen offering out quests, jobs, if you will, to the coteries, and the coteries go away and do them for the primogen, and the primogen hands out rewards. And the character deals +1 damage to characters with a title. So again, like you're saying there, the primogen bandied together would have the power to stop a tyrannical prince. The Herald. Now, the Herald of a domain. The Herald is a prince's voice, a spokesperson for the domain, spreading news and words of the prince. I've always seen this as in the games I've run has been a very powerful position, because the messenger allows you to open most doors. Everybody wants to speak to the prince's representative. and hear what they've got to say. And obviously having the Herald in your pocket and then networking means that you would be able to talk to many different vampires, and those conversations would allow them to sway them to your side more often. So you'd be paying one less to recruit vampires, and that's what was representing, bringing other vampires into your game, into your camp, and forming it with your coteries. So with the Herald as well, there's an unofficial title called the Harpy, and the Harpy is the vampire who gauges and judges station and a status and standing within a domain. And in smaller domains, I'll often roll the Herald and Harpy into the kind of same position. Bigger domains, you could probably have different ones. So I'm imagining the Herald going round saying, "Oh, hello, proposition, Nosferatu, Primogen. Here's the latest words from the Prince." I tell you what though, see while I was out and about, I was chatting to the Toreador Primogen Bradai, and he was saying some really interesting things about some Brujah wanting to take over the airport. Now, I'm not sure after the last rebellion that the Brujah had that they should be having that airport. I think the leader of the Brujah, Thomas Stoneman, he's getting a bit uppity on himself. What do you think? A really powerful position in the city, but it's a very soft power. And finally, we come to Keeper of Elysium. Now, a city will have many meeting places for vampires. When I run my tabletop games, I'll have low status meeting places, high status meeting places, general status meeting places. Often these are bars or establishments run by different vampires. However, there is a place called Elysium where vampires meet. Now, Elysium is sacred. The vampires have agreed that on Elysium there'd be no violence and no powers of the blood used. And to go against Elysium would be to remove yourself from society, from the agreements that bind society together. So at best you would become an outcast in the domain, at worst you would be hunted. Talk a bit more about that in the traditions. Now the Keeper of Elysium both maintains Elysium and its security and organises regular events. So again, a really important character in the domain. And I think the secrecy, so characters in your haven have +1 secrecy. So I think I'm looking at this a couple of ways. The first one is, if you've got the Keeper on side, you're probably more likely to use Elysium to move around and go and visit to your city. So when you're out and about, like your haven, I see as being kind of you in safe places. It's harder to get at them because you've got the Keeper's backing, and that's what that is representing. But also, the Keeper of Elysium would have a good idea about security and keeping safe, and it would be harder to attack the Keeper and the Keeper's friends because of allied friends. Vampires have no friends, they have allies. To attack their allies because of the extra precautions the Keepers learned to interact with. And I think that's plus what that secrecy is. Certainly for a homebody deck, Keeper is a really powerful card. You know, Nosferatu being able to attack minion people in the streets, the mortals on the streets from their haven with the sewers, plus this means Nosferatu could be a really difficult clan to shift. Now I said that's all the titles we've got now. There's a title coming out for the La Sombra, which are La Sombra specific. So some titles don't have cards right now. So the Scourge. Now the Scourge is feared as a headsman by vampires. They maintain the boundaries of the domain and hunts down unacknowledged vampires, thin bloods, and those without a clan known as the K-Teeth. They are often very physical and get very violent. I would expect something like the title giving unblockable targeted attacks on low blood potency vampires, perhaps. The Harpy, so we talked about the Herald and the Harpy getting rolled into one, and it's not a formal title, but since the Harpy is a vampire that keeps on top of the movers and shakers, opinion leaders, and spreading rumours and using society, a design space I'd maybe work on is something like the Shena Shell, but perhaps a Harpy token could be given out to a vampire, and that vampire could not be attacked for a round, in which case you've got the Harpy's support, or maybe conversely, you could get a token in which case any vampire could attack you for a round as the Harpies have scandalised you. And that's it for domain titles. Obviously, there's assistants and other. So, for example, every Primogen would have their equivalent of a Shena Shell. Clans might have clan leaders as well. Now, above the domain, there's a few titles. First up, there are Justicar. And there are only 5 vampires with the title Justicar. So each one of the main clans that form part of the Pillars of the Camarilla has a Justicar. Now, I don't know what they could do in game, but they would have to be powerful. Justicars deal with threats that transcend domains. They also go in and clean house when a prince has allowed the traditions to be broken. And generally, they're coming in to deal with egregious breaches of the masquerade. And they are the only vampire who could openly challenge a prince's word in their domain. So perhaps they could be linked to that effect, or do something with diminishing the prince. Perhaps if they could remove the title of prince. I don't know. Or maybe it could be an event. Justicar's investigation, discard the title of prince. And if the prince was becoming a card which helped win the games too often, that could be a good counter to the prince title. Now, Justicars have Archons, and Archons, each Justicar has a team of Archons, and they're given free agency again to prosecute missions for the Justicar gives them. So Justicar sometimes, if a domain's teetering, I might need a firm hand to bring it back into place, but not a clearing of house. And the Archon might be sent in just to let that prince know that the Justicars look in the inner circle aren't happy with them. So with the Archons, I would maybe have them do something that interferes with secrecy, as they are able to go where they want and have the skills and investigation. And often a Justicar might send an Archon round to investigate something, so they decide whether they should take more drastic action. And finally, there's the Inner Circle members. And again, the Inner Circle members, there's 5 Inner Circle members in the world. 1 for each one of the primary clans of the Camarilla. Who, at the moment, I think would be outside the scope of the game. And again, I really wouldn't know what Inner Circle members would do, because it's not a public title, and they are working the shadows to appoint the Justicars and to make sure Camarilla policy is at least aligned on a global level. The Inner Circle and the Justicars also sponsor the worst kindred in society into a most wanted list. This is called the Red List. And if you're placed on the Red List, clans will put a trophy on you. And if you're a vampire, you can go out and hunt people in the Red List, but it's very dangerous to do. And you gain great rewards, including the title Alistair, I believe, for hunting down and slaying those on the Red List. So that wraps up titles. Next, I have traditions coming. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found that really useful to start thinking about the domains, what the titles mean and what they do. If you got any thoughts, queries, questions, feel free to throw them in the comment section. And now it's time for my leaving quote. Again, I'm always rubbish with outros. The fact that I am rambling now about being rubbish at outros suggests, even though I've got a quote ready, how rubbish I am at outros. But anyway, here he goes. What is the meaning of words when they cease to function, when there is nothing to say? And that is from Killing Joke Requiem, which is a quote which was in Vampire the Masquerade 2nd edition. So anyway, you have a great evening. I look forward to chatting to you again. And that's goodbye from me. Goodbye.